Okay. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a restful sleep last night. We begin this morning with a celebration of the birthing of the 6th volume or anthology in the Catholic Theological Ethics series of the CTEWC. Antonio Otero, one of the co-editors and CTEWC Planning Committee member, will lead us in the book launching.
Morning to everyone. I have to greet you as co-editors of the book, also in the name of Laurenti Magesa. He is the co-author of the book. He is, because of health reasons, not able to travel anymore, and oh, good. Also in name of Laurenti Magesa too. The book, The Catholic Ethicist in the Local Church, is number 6 in the series of the book that was published at the initiative of the planning committee. This book focuses on particular aspects of the relationship between different contexts and cultures by aiming to articulate the profile of the Catholic ethicist in the local church. The 25 co-authors, please came here, joined me to the platform, the authors. 25 co-authors. Please don't count 25 because the one or the order is not here this morning, but in name of the authors of the book, the 25 co-authors are voices of the 5 continents. These voices reflect on the identity of the moral theologian, not from an abstract point of view, but in light of their concrete experience to being present and active in their local contexts and churches. The book is divided in 3 parts. In the first, the contributors ask the basic question that defines the relationship between ecclesiological and theological aspects of the ethics, foundational aspects. The second part contains more applied and practical reflections by focusing on the moral issues connected with concrete life in the local community. The emergence of local conflicts, as well as a strategy to address and resolve them, is the subject of the third part of our book. In an epilogue, a young ethicist examined critically the current landscape into North American theological ethics as a mirror in focus of new sensitivities and new ways of carrying out the work of the Catholic ethicist. I would like to say one word more, and this word is grazie. Muchas gracias, thank you, vielen Dank, merci beaucoup to all the authors of the book. For the patient, I know as co-editor, I was sometimes very impatient, but this is the rule of an editor. I would say danke, grazie, merci beaucoup. Also to Orbis Publisher. And I will say now the last word. This is the first copy of this book. I will gift the book to Christine Ayer in sign of wishing for the new leadership. Christine. To all of you, please, in the coffee break, go down at the book desk is the book to see, to pay, to buy, to acquire. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Antonio. We shall now proceed to the third plenary panel, where we shall address two major issues at the heart of the crisis in our world today: climate change and sustainability, and the tragic banality of contemporary political leadership in many countries. Our speaker on the climate crisis is George Koditotam, a Jesuit who teaches moral theology at Gujarat Vidya Deep Regional Seminary at Vadodara, India. He holds a degree in civil law, a master's degree in sociology, and a doctoral degree in moral theology from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. Besides teaching moral theology, he has been working as parish priest in rural mission parishes in Gujarat, India for over 2 decades. Our next three presenters will speak about the political crisis in various contexts, in the United States, Cameroon, and Hong Kong, respectively. Kenneth Himes, Order of Friar Minor, is Professor of Theological Ethics, former chairperson of the Theology Department at Boston College, and former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Awarded a PhD from Duke University in Religion and Public Policy, Father Himes has a special interest in the areas of Catholic social teaching and the role of the Church in American public life. The next paper is by Ludovic Lado, a Jesuit from Cameroon, who holds a doctorate in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford, UK. He has taught at the Catholic University of Central Africa and at the Jesuit University Institute in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and his current research focuses on religion and gender reforms in West Africa. Unfortunately, Father Ludo cannot be with us today because of problems with his passport. So Toussaint Kafarhire, a Congolese Jesuit, currently teaching at the Hekima Institute for Peace Studies and International Relations in Nairobi, will read his text for us. Our last speaker is Mary Ewan, Professor of Social Ethics at the Holy Spirit Seminary College of Theology and Philosophy, Hong Kong, and Vice Coordinator of Ecclesia of Women in Asia, an organization of Catholic women theologians. She obtained her PhD from the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, and her STL from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. We shall keep to the 15-minute rule, and at the end of the presentations, we hope to have a brief time for Q&A or open forum. So I now call on George Koditotam.
Good morning. Morning. Happy to be present here in front of all of you. See, my presentation is on the climate crisis and its impact on the environment and marginalized populations in the Indian subcontinent. I'm making this presentation from the point of view of the impacts of this crisis for average people within the Indian subcontinent. So I taken 3 points basically in the presentation. First, a brief understanding of what the climate crisis is, then identifying who are the victims, then specifically what is the impact of the crisis or climate changes on India, and thirdly, India's response to this crisis. And the last point I would like to discuss or just present is the ethical issues involved. That is at two levels. One is at the global level, internationally, what is the ethical issues involved in the climate crisis? And secondly, at the particular Indian level, what is ethical issues, especially based on the Indian attitude towards development, which India is aspiring to. So changes in the global climate have been occurring naturally across centuries and millennia because of continental drifts, various astronomical cycles, variations in solar energy output, and volcanic activities. Now we have realized that humankind's activities are significantly accelerating this process by increasing the atmospheric concentration of heat-trapping gases called greenhouse gases or GHGs. High concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere leads to climate changes such as temperature changes, sea level rise in the frequency of extreme weather events such as floods, cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes, and so on. Carbon dioxide emission due to fossil fuel burning is one of the crucial factors in climate change, and it accounts for 65% of GHG emissions now. Cumulated emissions due to fossil fuel burning from 1950 to 1990 were approximately 160 billion tons. However, current emissions due to fossil fuel are about 37 billion tons per year. So, unchecked GHG emissions would lead to catastrophic consequences. Though it is uncertain exactly when these effects will occur and due to how much concentrations, it is certain that they will occur. Now, the victims of climate change. In general, the poor are always more vulnerable to any calamity compared to the well-off. For example, in the 1993 earthquake in Latur in India, more than 10,000 people died, compared to less than 100 in the earthquake of similar intensity in California. Nearly half of Bangladesh and most of the Pacific islands could submerge due to increased floods and sea level rise, resulting in huge loss of human life, homelessness, and other colossal economic and environmental damages. While Netherlands is able to build more digs for protection against sea level rise, Bangladesh does not have the wherewithal for it. Climate change impacts are most felt in the agriculture sector, and the poor peasants of the developing countries will be the worst affected. The share of populations depending on agriculture is around 60% of the total population in India and Bangladesh, while it is only 2% in the US. Flora and fauna are even more vulnerable to climate change than poor people. In the extent of the loss of species and damage to biodiversity caused by climate change is difficult to calculate. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, 150 species are going extinct every day. Although species have been going extinct since the beginning of life, the current rates are between 1,000 and 10,000 faster than earlier. This erosion of diversity poses a huge threat to the survival of all forms of life. Impact of climate crisis on India. India is now considered the fourth most vulnerable country to usually high occurrence of extreme rain events. The 2017 monsoon was a case in the point where extreme rain concentrations of a few days interspersed with long periods of heavy deficiencies affected India's water resources. According to the Ministry of Water Resources, the amount of water available per person in India is decreasing steadily and drastically by 70% in 60 years from 1951 to 2011. Highly climate sensitive Indian agriculture, 65% of which is in rain-fed areas, contributes nearly 25% of GDP and employs 60% of the total workforce. Variations in weather, warming as well as drought and floods make farming increasingly risky. In a recent submission to a parliamentary committee, the Agricultural Ministry of the Government of India stated that extreme weather events were costing India 9 to 10 billion US annually. In 2015, one or other manifestations of climate change damaged over 18 million hectares of crops. Farming has become risky to the point of farmers committing suicide. Studies suggest that rising temperatures increase suicide rate through an agriculture channel of lowered crop yields, which leads to income insecurity. The central government of India informed the Indian Supreme Court in May 2017 that over 12,000 farmers are committing suicide every year since 2013. Suicide by farmers taking place in increasing number are the starkest manifestation of India's agrarian crisis. India has a low-lying, densely populated coastline extending to about 6,500 kilometers with the paddy fields that are highly vulnerable to flood and salinization. Now, India's response to climate crisis. India's approach to dealing with the climate change has been high on rhetoric and low on policy planning and implementation. Even though Indian negotiators had been actively participating in the international climate change negotiations since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the National Action Plan for Climate Change was released by the Government of India only in June 2008, and the regional level planning began 7 years later. The Indian government uses double standards in its pledge towards climate change on the one hand and its action on the other. At the COP21 summit ahead of the drafting of Paris Agreement, the Prime Minister said that India would enlarge its forests to absorb 2.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. On returning to India, however, he directed the Environment Ministry to loosen its regulations so that coal mines can be given licenses more liberally. In his recent joint announcement with the French President Macron, the Indian Prime Minister said India would go above and beyond the Paris Agreement to fight climate change. But since he came to power in 2014, his actions, in line with an aggressive and unsustainable model of development, have favored corporations whose interests go counter to environmental goals. India has witnessed rapid urbanization in the last 3 decades. The urban population has nearly doubled from 222 million in 1994 to 410 million in 2017. This rapid urbanization is without proper planning for climate change resilience. The Smart City mission of the Indian government is a glaring example. Since its launch 2 years ago, 90 cities have been chosen to be modernized under the mission at a total cost close to 200,000 million Indian rupees. Yet, their development strategies do not include the issue of mitigating climate changes. Now, coming to the ethical issue involved in the climate crisis, first at the global level. Global level, the greatest ethical issue, the biggest issue is regarding the responsibility for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A primary feature of the climate crisis is the inverse relationship between countries that are responsible for this problem and those that will likely bear the burden of the impacts. The rich developed countries account for 75% of global emissions, while the likely effect of the climate change will be felt mostly in the poor and developing countries. Present levels of emission from the developed countries are much higher than their per capita share of environmental space, while from the developing countries it is far below. This puts greater responsibility of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions on the developed countries. Pope Francis recently affirmed it when he called for a greater commitment on the part of the polluter nations. One way of containing emissions is through trading in them by applying polluters pay principle. As these market-based schemes of tradable permits emerge as a policy instrument of choice internationally, it is most important that these allocations of carbon emission quotas are made equitably. In an equitable allocation based on a per capita rule, the developing countries will get permits in excess of their actual emissions, and trading them will lead to real transfer of resources from the rich countries to the poor, countries. In the final analysis, climate change is not only the serious environmental problem facing the global community, but it is a wider ethical problem to be managed in an increasingly competitive, merciless, and greedy international economic realm. The developing countries are not significant participants in the international institutions where the broader questions surrounding climate change are shaped. This is another important ethical issue. In large part, this has allowed the concerns of the developed countries to dominate proceedings. In the international policy decisions, risk minimization in the developing countries should be given priority over the much-hyped cost minimization of emission mitigation in the developed countries. Engagement of the developing countries on an equal footing in the sophisticated international negotiations on the climate issue is fundamental in this context. With the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is very much diluted. Per capita emission is also an indirect indicator of living standards. The countries with low per capita emissions have very low living standards. All countries need to secure a decent standard of living for citizens. The interest of all late developers to reach comparable standards of living for their people have to be taken care of. Loss of species or damage to biodiversity is being considered only recently the environmental impact assessment framework. These assertions, even when they are included, are anthropocentric, where species are valued for their use for humankind. As Pope Francis says, different species are not merely potential resources to be exploited. The anthropocentric view needs to be replaced with a more ecocentric view where humankind is seen as one of the species on Earth, though with a unique dignity, having one interdependent existence with the nature. Humankind is expected not just to live in harmony and balance with other species, but share with them the whole biosphere, which provides sustenance to all other species too. An India-specific ethical concern, India is stressing its right of emerging countries to pursue development and growth to alleviate poverty. However, it is flawed idea of development is causing disproportionate problems India should not risk its responsibility for reducing its emission levels and should change its priorities. Thank you.
Good morning, good people. The title of my presentation is A Nation with a Crisis, Trump as Cause and Effect. Today, 63% of Americans say that Donald Trump does not provide moral leadership. This is not a dispute over a particular issue, but an overall sensibility that Donald Trump is, in the words of the Catholic journalist Michael Sean Winters, quote, not fit morally, intellectually, even psychologically for this presidency, unquote. Certainly Donald Trump has heightened a sense of political and moral crisis in the United States. Bishop Robert McElroy of San Diego has observed, and I quote, Trump has accelerated and crystallized a profound crisis at the core of American political culture, unquote. It's a crisis that involves the repudiation of our history as a nation of immigrants, the abandonment of the human rights aspirations that were present at our founding, and the loss of the sense of solidarity and sacrifice which tied together a nation that was not built upon bloodlines. Yet it is not simply Trump. He is both cause and effect of the crisis. To understand any leader, it is useful to examine the context within which the leader functions. So briefly, I note a few significant aspects of the present political environment in the United States. Humans are social animals. Like other primates, we are tribal animals. We need to belong to groups, which is why we identify with sports teams and social clubs. The identities that matter most may be national, but also ethnic, regional, religious, or clan-based. In the U.S. today, a person's political identity has become increasingly a tribal identity of great importance. In the United States, negative partisanship, that is, people's negative view of the other side, rather than a positive view of their own side, has become increasingly decisive for many voters. Preventing the other side from winning can feel like the most important objective. This is one reason for the spread of fake news. Sharing negative stories about the other side is a way to demonstrate tribal affiliation with one's own. As a consequence of negative partisanship, anger has become the primary motivational tool for many voters. Exit polling revealed that many voters went to the 2016 polls to vote against a candidate rather than for one. Now, there are various ways one can understand this tribalism dynamic. One factor is Christian nationalism, which was a stronger indicator of voting for Trump than being anti-immigrant, sexist, or anxious about the economy. What the term refers to is the belief that the U.S. is a Christian nation. It is more about the country than about faith. It's more about belonging than believing. It is a way of defining us as distinct from them. Christian nationalism leads to negative views of religious minorities, especially Muslims. Still another way to describe the us versus them mentality is to recognize that wealth in the United States is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people, most of whom live on the two coasts. This minority dominates key sectors of the economy, including finance and banking, the media, and high tech. Although these coastal elites do not belong to any one ethnicity, they are culturally distinct, often sharing cosmopolitan values such as secularism, multiculturalism, toleration of sexual minorities, holding pro-immigration and pro-globalization policies. These values create a sense of anxiety among other Americans, particularly those living in small towns and rural regions. Almost 70% of the white working class believe that the American way of life needs to be protected from foreign influence, and that America is losing its culture and identity. This reflects the anti-immigrant sentiment that Trump has fed, and also makes some sense of Trump's international politics. Globalization and foreign trade can seem to be a transfer of power from us to them. For Trump, global politics and economics is largely a zero-sum game that must have winners and losers. Recent social science research on Americans has suggested that a large swath of voters hold a worldview that seeks social order and favors culturally created rules. This group is contrasted with voters who have greater openness to social change and diversity. These two groups have sorted themselves out into different parties that are more grounded in social and moral values, geographic locale, and identity politics than had been the case in the past. 86% of white voters who prefer social order and cohesion over personal autonomy and diversity voted for Trump. The new developing paradigm, political paradigm, is between those who prefer globalism versus those who prefer nationalism. American political parties are sorting themselves out so that globalists are aligned increasingly with Democrats and nationalists with the Republicans. A pattern emerges: for or against Christian identity, for or against those with college degrees versus the college educated, blue collar versus white collar, white versus person of color, native versus immigrant. Trump has accelerated but did not create these trends. After all, Trump's nationalism and autocratic tendencies are not simply American, but part of a global trend. Russia, Turkey, Thailand, and the Philippines have gone in more authoritarian directions since 2000. India, Indonesia, Great Britain have become more nationalistic. The Arab Spring failed just about everywhere. We are in a period of global democratic recession, where the number of democracies has diminished and where the quality of governance in the remaining democracies has deteriorated. Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, South Africa under Zuma, with Maduro in Venezuela, and the Ortegas in Nicaragua. Translators, I'm skipping the next paragraph. It's before Agnes gets at me. In the U.S., the politics of resentment thrives when the middle and working classes are hollowed out. When people are losing ground and losing hope, when they feel their economic future is in jeopardy, when they believe their children have fewer opportunities than they themselves had in their youth, that's when people are vulnerable to demagogues who scapegoat the outsider. The other, whether the other are immigrants at home or foreign workers abroad. The fact is, American middle and working class families are not wrong to feel left behind. Median wages in the U.S. have been stagnating for decades. Jobs are becoming more and more precarious. Retirement pensions are uncertain. All the while housing, childcare, and education are harder to afford. With the dramatic decline in labor unions, Trump has appealed to other identities among the white working class, such as nationality, race, geography, and religion. It must be emphasized, however, that overall, poor and working class Americans did not support Trump. It was whites on all levels of income who gave him his electoral victory. Trump is not the leader of a true working class populist revolt. He is the leader of a white backlash movement. Politics in the United States is held in low repute, with many citizens both cynical and angry. The crisis is the lack of confidence that those with political power are truly seeking the common good and the public's interest. In addition, a culture of resentment and polarization dominates over a culture of engagement and dialogue, such as Pope Francis talks about. Many today view those with whom they disagree as not only wrong, but even brainwashed or stupid. Not only different, but deplorable. Needed to counteract this is a political ethic that must be embodied by citizens and leaders prior to addressing individual policies. To quote Bishop Robert McElroy again, we need a Catholic political imagination. We need a social ethic that underscores the importance of certain virtues for our time and place. I close by citing 4 such virtues. First, a solidarity that recognizes we are all indebted to one another. In place of populist nationalism that defines we the people in an exclusionary way, the Catholic community must promote the virtue of solidarity that moves us beyond tribalism to inclusiveness. We must substitute for American first the idea that the interest of the U.S. is connected to the demands of the international common good, whether it be the Paris Climate Accords, fair trade agreements, or refugee assistance. So many of our global crises are caused by our inability to acknowledge in a meaningful way that all people and all creation exists because the one God has made us all. Second, social justice in the Catholic tradition must always look to the biblical triad of widows, orphans, and aliens. More people are being excluded from the social contract as the U.S. has become an increasingly unfair society. There is an inflection upon social justice that comes about because of the influence of compassion in the Christian tradition. Too many are callous to the suffering of others because those others do not share our political preferences. We must care about what happens to people rather than caring about who it happens to. Another vital virtue of the imagination is intellectual humility. The culture of resentment and polarization breeds arrogance, which makes political discourse difficult because there is so little humility in the way Americans engage with whom we disagree. Finally, most urgent at this time in the US is to recover the virtue of hope. It was the Roman poet Juvenal, writing at the time of the end of the empire, at the end of the Republic and the rise of the empire, who said of the Roman people, "Two things only the people anxiously desire, bread and circuses." It is easy to give up hope because Trump is largely about the circus. He provides little in the way of substance, of bread. It helps Trump if we keep drawing attention to and even contribute to the political circus of Twitter feeds, repeated lies, and ad hominem attacks. It is greater economic fairness and social solidarity that will prevent him and other demagogues from future success. Our hope in this time of crisis is that the Catholic community can join with other people of goodwill to work on behalf of those who need bread, who want politics to be nourishing, to be about substance, to serve the common good. After all, that is what Catholic social teaching is about. It is what Catholic social teaching has always imagined about politics, that it be the arena where men and women come together to seek the best interest of each and all of us. Thank you.
To Sant Kapahire for Father Ludovic Lado.
Political Crisis and Social Ethics in an African Context by Ludovic Lado. I was born and grew up in Cameroon, a country of 22 million inhabitants located in West Africa, which became independent in 1960 after a colonial history involving the Germans, the English, and the French. Since independence, Cameroon has had only two heads of state. The first ruled from 1967 until his sudden resignation in 1982. The second, his then Prime Minister, took over in 1982 and is still in power at age 85, and there are indications that he wants to seek another term. During these 58 years of political independence, there have been many elections, but only God knows whether any of these has ever been democratic. In other words, in my 48 years of existence, I have known only two heads of state. The sad truth is that after many years of poor governance, Cameroon is now confronted with a quasi-civil war, which is basically a crisis of social justice. It is from this context, which of course is not representative of the whole of Africa, that I am speaking about political crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of good governance, the 2007 Mo Ibrahim Index estimates is that the average for the whole continent is 50.8 out of 100. In area of security and rule of law, Africa scores 52.8 out of 100. Participation and human rights, 49.4. Sustainable economic development, 45.1. Human development, 56.1. Continental average, 50.8. Obviously, and fortunately, some African countries, though not many, are doing far better than others. Countries such as Mauritius, Seychelles, Botswana, Capo Verde are doing quite well with an average of over 70%. But most are still lagging behind. Since the 90s, progress towards a more democratic culture is steady but very slow. Dismantling monolithic political structures and mindsets has proven to be a very difficult task which requires a lot of patience and resilience from organizations and people committed to working for change. Most political crises in Africa are often related to competition for power and for the control of economic resources coveted by foreign companies. Oftentimes, the economic interests of multinational firms are the deciding factor. African countries rich in mineral resources tend to be plagued by political crises, civil wars, which work for the selfish interest of corrupt governments and their foreign corporate accomplices. It is in this context that I have been asking myself questions such as, what does social ethics mean for me and my people? What is the relevance of Catholic social teaching in the face of such challenges? How does one translate social justice theories into practice in such context? How much of the related responsibility is individual and how much is collective? My first contact with Catholic social teaching occurred in the early 90s when I began training for priesthood. It was mainly an introduction to papal encyclicals since Rerum Novarum and to Gaudium et Spes. But it was all about theoretical principles, nothing about how to translate these into practice in a parish or a Christian organization. In those years, Africa was beginning its transition from autocratic regimes to a more pluralistic political culture. Those were years of political, economic, and political crisis all over the continent. Structural adjustment programs prescribed by the Bretton Woods institutions, supposedly to help the continent recover economically, only made things worse for the poor. In such a context, hermeneutical principles such as the preferential option for the poor began to make sense to me. But the turning point for me was when I joined the Society of Jesus in 1992 and was introduced in the novitiate to the Decree 4 of the 32nd General Congregation of the Jesuits, which had taken place in Rome in 1974. This decree redefined the mission of the Society of Jesus in the world in terms of the service of faith and the promotion of justice. I was definitely fascinated by the way of linking faith with issues of justice, and since then, I have been asking myself what that means and imply concretely in the public sphere and in the particular context of political crisis and economic injustices in Africa. How does that translate into practice as Jesuits, as a church, individually or collectively? These questions have shaped both my intellectual and spiritual journey in the Society of Jesus until today. I have developed academic interest in political philosophy, in social ethics, and in social sciences. For example, for my master's thesis in theology, I attempted a comparative study of the basic principles of Catholic social teaching and the capability approach of Amartya Sen in an effort to explore one of the ways of translating Catholic social teaching into a policy scheme. Then I went on to do a doctorate in social and cultural anthropology as I was looking for better tools for social and political analysis for African societies. After completing my doctorate, I was asked to join the Jesuit team at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Management at the Catholic University of Central Africa in Yaoundé, in Cameroon, my home country. Faced with the challenges of the context sketched earlier, my main concern was the role of the Jesuit intellectual in the public sphere. I decided that I had to do more than just confine myself to university duties of teaching and researching. I came to the conclusion that my vocation as a Jesuit and a university lecturer required from me not only to pay attention to what was going on in the country, but to speak out on structural justice issues arising from both in society and in the church. After more than a decade of a few challenging experiments in this field, my feeling is that the church has not fully grasped the pastoral implications of John Paul II's concept of social structures of sin, or social sin, which are at the root of most political crises in the world in general and in Africa in particular. The church is more comfortable with addressing the effects of structural justice than tackling the root causes of injustices in the world. I have also come to realize that the ministry of confronting social structures of injustice is dangerous. The difficulty is well captured in Africa Munus, the post-synodal exhortation in which Pope Benedict fleshed out the public role of the Church in Africa following the Second African Synod in 2009 in Rome. The Synod focused on reconciliation, justice, and peace in African societies plagued by conflict and injustices. Discerning the Church's public role, Pope Benedict XVI wrote, I quote, "The task we have to set for ourselves is not an easy one. Situated as it is somewhere between immediate engagement in politics, which lies outside the Church's direct competence, and the potential for withdrawal or evasion present in a theological and spiritual speculation, which could serve as an escape from concrete historical responsibility." End of quote. About the unjust world order, which is one of the root causes of political crisis in Africa, Pope Benedict writes again, I quote, "Together with the Synod Fathers, I asked all members of the Church to work and speak out in favor of an economy that cares for the poor and is resolutely opposed to an unjust order which, under the pretext of reducing poverty, has often helped to aggravate it. God has given Africa important natural resources. Given the chronic poverty of its people, who suffer the effect of exploitation and embezzlement of funds, both locally and abroad, the opulence of certain groups shocks the human conscience. Organized for the creation of wealth in their homelands, and not infrequently with the complicity of those in power in Africa, these groups too often ensure their own prosperity at the expense of the well-being of the local population." End of quote. The exhortation does not depart from the principles laid out in Gaudium et Spes more than 5 decades ago about the distinction and independence of the religious and political spheres, about the distribution of spheres between the clergy and laity. Indeed, about the political responsibility of the laity, Gaudium et Spes reads, "Secular duties and activities belong properly, although not exclusively, to laymen. Therefore, acting as citizens in the world, whether individually or socially, they will keep the laws proper to each discipline, and labor to equip themselves with a genuine expertise in their various fields. They will gladly work with men seeking the same goals. Acknowledging the demands of faith and endowed with its force, they will unhesitatingly devise new enterprises where they are appropriate and put them into action. Laymen should also know that it is generally the function of their well-formed Christian conscience to see that the divine law is inscribed in the life of the earthly city. From priests, they may look for spiritual light and nourishment. Let the layman not imagine that his pastors are always such experts, that to every problem which arises, however complicated, they can readily give him a concrete solution, or even that such is their mission. Rather, enlightened by Christian wisdom and giving close attention to the teaching authority of the church, let the layman on his own distinctive role. In other words, the clergy is to stay away from partisan politics and leave it to laymen to engage the messiness of the secular activities. That said, there are exceptional situations where some African bishops have been called upon to play important roles of political mediation in order to negotiate peaceful transitions in their countries, precisely because of their non-partisanship. On the other hand, the Church relies on the laity to translate Catholic social teaching into secular activities, but in practice, Catholic laymen are invisible in the political landscape in Africa. They either stay away from political life or they tend to separate their spiritual life from their political commitment. This invisibility of the Catholic laity in politics is, from my point of view, the main obstacle to the translation of social ethics into political practice in Africa. Thank you.
Mary Ewan.
Good morning. The title of my presentation today is Political Crisis in Hong Kong and Ethical Response. About 4 years ago, in 2014, hundreds and thousands of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong occupied several busy districts for 79 days, demanding greater democracy and open electoral system in Hong Kong and against the increasingly interference in the politics and internal affairs of Hong Kong from the central or Beijing government. It was the worldwide well-known umbrella revolution or Occupy movement. 4 years have passed. There is no progress in democratization of the political structure, and the pro-democracy camp is in an adverse situation, no matter in the Legislative Council or social movement. In this presentation, I would like to share with you some features or symptoms of the existing political crisis after the umbrella movement. I will also share points of my ethical reflections. The first symptom is the serious rift in the society in general and also splits within the pro-democracy camp. On the one hand, the pro-democracy camp criticized the pan-democratic camp that they tend to vote against all policies proposed by the Hong Kong government, and they guide the youth to a confrontational state, unwilling to grasp the opportunities in economic development offered by China. On the other hand, the pan-democratic camp also points out that the pro-establishment camp support the government blindly, without recognizing the regression of Hong Kong's civil rights and social problems. On top of that, there is internal dispute within the pro-democratic camp with the rise of localism. Some people, especially the younger generation, challenge the traditional, peaceful, and rational way of striving for democracy, for it achieved nothing in the past years. They respond by advocating greater autonomy, self-rule, self-determination, and even independence. Hitting the bottom line of the central government, which in turn reinforced China's suspicion and led to further uncompromising response. The activists claim themselves localists, which is also called rightists, inclining to employ more radical or even violent means in sometimes, stressing separation between Hong Kongers and mainlanders, whereas others claim themselves self-determinists who incline to be leftists, emphasizing community building and employing non-violence means. Hong Kong sociologist Lui Tai Lok points out that these camps often blaming each other for destroying the order, refusing to explore a way to communicate, to discuss rationally and to solve the conflict. The second symptom is the blocking of young activists from political participation by the Hong Kong and Chinese government. Although many young people were very disappointed after the umbrella movement, they did not feel totally despair. They tried to find their own ways in actualizing their goals. Some are active in community work, others try to establish political groups and participating in elections. The localists and self-determinists won a number of seats in the Legislative Council election after the umbrella movement, and this emerging force was expected to grow. However, some of them were banned from running the election. Even when they won, some were disqualified from their seats based on their attitudes of taking oath to the legislators, through the interpretation of the relevant law by the Chinese government. This also means the pro-democratic camp lost its veto power over major legislation and policy relating to the well-being of people. It is clear that the localist faction is not allowed to participate in politics through mainstream channels. Moreover, the government has also begun to prosecute and imprison young people with experiences in social movement. They detained they were put in jail from several months to several years. Recently, a local student leader was sentenced to jail for 6 years due to rioting. Some people query the independence of the courts. When the path to political participation is blocked and the risk of participating in traditional social movements is higher, but the basic structural factors that lead to social dissatisfaction have not changed, it is expected that young people would either stay away from social movement or social protests or turn to wildcat-style actions, such as using rough language to criticize the opposite camp, or more violent means. However, resistance and struggle based on hatred may cause irreparable harm to society in the long run. It is necessary to reopen the space and channels for young people to participate in political affairs. The third symptom is the beginning of the breakdown of rules and laws in various systems in Hong Kong, and the abuse of power and the neglect of role of monitoring by the government officials, and ignoring professional ethics, just as the style in mainland China. In the past, Hong Kong was often regarded as an efficient city in good order, with a team of honest and clean civil servants. However, in recent years, numerous issues revealed the erosion of rules of law, the shaking of rule of law, bribery, and corruption came back. Misconduct of the high-ranking officials as well as our chief executive, that is the governor. The unjust political system and the domination of the privilege in the executive and legislative branch of the government, as well as the division in the society, resulted in the reinforcement of the economic and social problems. In spite of the prosperity and economic growth of Hong Kong in general, there is unequal distribution of wealth and disparity between the rich and the poor. Many people, especially the low-income class, are unable to benefit from the fruits of economic development. The government policies that favor the property developers led to the housing costs unaffordable, and many small businesses are dragged down by the high rents. Many businesses also follow the government policy, contracting out works and service to private companies, leaving many workers unprotected and being exploited. There are also many aging poor, and many families have to live indecently in small cubic units. Meanwhile, it is ironic to see that Hong Kong has a very large sum of financial reserve. Income inequality, in fact, became a source of conflict and affects the ineffectiveness of government. And the more deep-rooted reason behind all these symptoms is the ever-increasing tense and distrustful relationship between China and Hong Kong. When Britain handed Hong Kong's sovereignty back to Communist China in 1997, it was agreed that Hong Kong would maintain our own laws, courts, economic system, and freedom that are different from the communist China under the one country, two system policies, and also a high degree of autonomous rule. However, since 2003, 5 years after the changeover, after the proposal to enact a law on subversion and secession, which is considered an infringement of the freedom of expression, and the subsequent large-scale rally, Chinese intervention in Hong Kong policy became more and more obvious. This can be seen in a number of issues, including the interpretation of the Basic Law, the mini-constitution of Hong Kong, several times which were considered to be infringing on the rule of law, and also the intervention in election and electoral reform, and the joint immigration control arrangement recently about the cross-border express rail, which will allow mainland officers to exercise their power in Hong Kong. And another deep-rooted reason is the authoritarian and paternalistic ruling style of the Beijing government and the historical and cultural differences between China and Hong Kong. Since China became a world power, no other countries dare to challenge China except Donald Trump. And in fact, China inclines more and more to dominate and emphasize on one country rather than two systems. As a special administrative region of China, it is more and more difficult for Hong Kong to resist. And we often use an analogy to describe this situation is like an egg against the high wall. In the face of the above scenario, with a lot of frustration and helpless feeling, bringing out a message of hope to Hong Kong people at a time of impasse is imperative. When John of the Cross talked about that night, he said that it is not a sign of death, but a sign of life, of growth, of development in our relationship with God, in our best human relationship, and in our societal life. It is a sign of to move on in hope to a new vision. In the process of bringing the impasse to contemplative prayer, to action, to the perspective of God who loves us, we can be transformed and our society will be free, healed, changed, and brought to new visions. In a talk show with the theme, The Future You, the future is made of yous, Pope Francis points out that, I skip a few lines for the translator to know, hope is the name of future. Feeling hopeful does not mean to be optimistically naive and ignore the tragedy humanity is facing. In fact, a single individual is enough for hope to exist, and that individual can be you, and then there will be another you, and it turns into an us. There begins a revolution. Thus, Hong Kong people need to unite together to build a just and care society, regardless of our differences. To convey the message of hope, the Justice and Peace Commission of the Hong Kong Diocese organized a series of public prayer gatherings with the theme Hope in Darkness. Social activists and people striving for democracy and justice, as well as church leaders and pastors, have been invited to share their experiences and message of the gospel respectively. In the face of the deep rift of the society, reminding people the spirit of dialogue and listening to each other is also important. The only way to foster understanding and respect is authentic dialogue among various parties on an equal base. People of different opinions should be open to discuss in a rational way in order to achieve common good. Willingness to dialogue and listening is always an important factor that leads to reconciliation in a split society. Equally important is to nurture a democratic character, practicing democratic values in daily life. In affirming the moral and social responsibilities of political leaders, it is important to remind them to nurture the virtue of prudence in the church and society. As political leaders, they should discern how to rule the society with the goals of common good and taking care of the vulnerable, not just emphasizing economic development. They should open space for young people to participate socially and politically through various channels. Moreover, how to persuade the central government to let Hong Kong people rule ourselves in order to keep the society stable requires wisdom. If the mainland officials can keep a distance from Hong Kong internal affairs, it will be possible to rebuild mutual trust, and Hong Kong can walk out of its predicament. The pro-establishment politicians and chief executive have a special role in it, and also our church leaders. To advocate structural change is difficult, but not impossible. It is a long-term endeavor, and we need the virtue of persistence and courage. In the face of a strong authoritarian power, we need to strengthen the civic virtue of courage and dare to speak up and point out the unjust practice, especially relating to rule of law, abuse of power, and the erosion of professional ethics. We should form a conscience understanding the meaning of justice and solidarity and dare to act accordingly as a free moral agents. A slogan in the umbrella movement is always a good reminder to us all. We act not because we see hope. We see hope when we act. Thank you.
I would like to thank our speakers for the various insights they have offered. Father George posed the challenge on the global level to reduce greenhouse emissions following a polluter's pay principle, as well as the need for India to rethink its concept of development. Both Father Kenneth and Mary, on the other hand, focus on the virtues that need to be fostered to face threats to democracy in the US and Hong Kong. They listed the virtues of solidarity, social justice, intellectual humility, hope, prudence, and courage. Finally, Father Ludovic pointed out that the invisibility of the Catholic laity in politics is a main obstacle to the translation of social ethics into political practice in Africa. We now have a little more than 15 minutes to accept brief questions and responses. And Father Toussaint expressed willingness to accept clarificatory questions on Father Ludo's paper. There are microphones on the side that can be passed on to those who will ask questions. And before asking your question, please state your name, country, and the person to whom you are addressing your question. Okay, yeah. Yes, Christina? And another question, we'll take 2 questions. Yeah.
Christina Storga, U.S. Philippines. I'd like to address my question to Father Himes. Father, I really appreciated your talk. It was a very illuminating talk. And I was particularly struck by what you said, that Trump was catapulted to victory, not by a populist revolt, but by a white backlash revolt. I agree with you in a certain sense, but I'd rather say that he was catapulted to revolt because he hijacked populist causes and made them his propaganda tool. But this was just a propaganda tool. For Trump, there is no reference larger than himself. For Trump, his interest, the only interest of Trump, is Trump.
Okay. The second one, yes.
My name is Ken Weir from San Francisco, and my question is what I think you tried to respond to, but it's the question that comes to me the most these days from people who've been active on climate change issues ever since Earth Day in 1970, and particularly in the last decade leading up to the Paris Agreement, and that is, what is the basis of hope? Because all this time we tried to address the issue of the reason there's climate change. What is the basis of it? Why is it coming to be? It seems that most people simply accept the fact it's it. Now we have to deal, and all the time and the energy is given to how we're going to cope with climate change. We can't do anything about stopping it. And tons of money. I mean, despite what Trump says, it doesn't believe in climate change, the fact is his government is spending billions of dollars every year addressing climate change. The Pentagon itself spends over $1 billion on how to respond to climate change, so it's a given. You know, despite the Paris Agreement, it's a given. And so people are now saying, what is the basis of hope if climate change is coming and we can't really do anything about it? We can build a wall on Miami Beach, which is not reason people go there, they want to swim. They can build a wall to keep the water out. You know, and even persons who actually love their grandchildren, there are some, you know, and are concerned about the future. What is the hope?
Okay. Yes, Father Ken?
I'll be brief, Christina. I'm not sure that we disagree on this. I mean, the word populism can be used in a wide variety of ways, right? It's one of those terms that we all use it, but we almost all should stipulate what we mean by it when we use it. But I think it's fair to say, at least in U.S. history, broadly speaking, there are two families of populism. One group of populists are truly economic populists. It's a movement that represented and has represented the needs of the emerging industrial worker at the turn of the 20th century. It's also represented small family farmers in the 1800s. It was always a movement that was concerned with the economic interests of, let's say, the lower 2 quintiles of the population, the bottom 40%. But there is also another form of populism that's also there in American history, and this is a populism that is not really built upon the economic concerns of the poorer and working classes. It's a populism that's cultural and ideological, and it's built on some notion of what it means to truly be one of the people. And so that we, the people, becomes defined in a way that we are the people who are different than you. And that's been used to oppose immigration in the past. It's been used, of course, to oppose African-American progress in the past. That's been there in American history. And it seems to me that what Trump did was he co-opted the first movement, which I think we genuinely need right now in the United States. But I think he co-opted the first movement by sending out the various signs and dog whistles of the second movement. And so I think really the way to understand Trump is he has expressed little or no interest in the details of economic policy, right? And you hear that all the time from anybody who meets with him, whether it was his own party talking about tax reform or trade policy now. He has very little interest actually in the details of economic policy. He's really a president of cultural movements rather than economic movements. And the particular cultural movement I think he's promoting is one that I think is endemically racist and xenophobic.
I don't think it is possible to give a definitive and conclusive answer to the issues you raised. But I think it is generally agreed among scientists who studied the issue 3 points. First, that climate change was happening always from the very beginning itself. But definitively, human actions are accelerating the process, which we can, if we take can slow down. As I said in the presentation, though we do not know when exactly, and due to how much the GHS concentration, these changes will happen, but now it is conclusively understood that it will happen. And when it happens, the effect of it is going to be much more on the poorer countries. That's a definite fact. And we are not really the one who caused the trouble. The trouble is that this acceleration is caused because of the unmindful process of development, industrial development, happened using, especially because of the fossil fuel use. So that's happening, therefore, somebody is going to pay. Now, there is a possibility of reducing it. But we cannot say conclusively how much, but at least we should make an effort to make it delayed and reduce the impact as much as possible. It's not only on human populations, as also the harm done to the whole of environment, flora and fauna. That's again, and it's understood, and the university accepted that the depleting of these sources is going to affect all forms of human life. Therefore, this process, I don't think it can be totally halted. But the fact exists, we have a moral obligation to keep up as much as possible. At least make an effort, even when we are not sure that we will succeed, we have a moral, ethical obligation to make an effort, without even knowing that we may not fully succeed. That responsibility, I don't think we can escape from. I think that's the main input on this. So this will happen, but we have a responsibility. Are we to respond to that? And the other point is that environment also is understood as something we are made co-responsible. Therefore, it is basically an ethic of responsibility, not only to the fellow human beings, but to the whole of the environment.
So, yes, the gentleman at the back. And yes, and the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I would like to appreciate the point made by Father Ludovic about the need for lay people to translate the social teachings into the public sphere. At the same time, speaking as a lay person, my name is David Kaulem, I'm coming from Zimbabwe. And speaking as somebody who has engaged bishops and bishops' conferences in the Southern African region, one gets the sense that as a lay person, even if I'm inspired by the Catholic social teaching, I cannot represent the church. Now, who represents the church is the bishop. And my experience is that the bishops in general have tended to manage the way in which lay people participate in the public sphere. Speaking as somebody coming from Zimbabwe, I have a sense that, in fact, how do you explain that Mugabe is a Catholic and the Bishops' Conference, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, is very powerful and leads in many ways the faith in the country. And yet we have 38 years of continued oppression. So my experience is this, that unless we interrogate the way in which lay people can represent the church in the public sphere and translate genuinely and engage and challenge our bishops' conferences, I don't think the Catholic social teaching will be translated in practice.
Thank you very much for the observation, more than it is a question. And I think this is really the core of what Lado's paper was addressing, reminding that there is that necessity to form conscience or consciences of the laity so that they can be where they are supposed to be. Just to use a quick example, I would refer to the role that the laity is playing in the political crisis in the Congo today, the Democratic Republic of Congo. What we see is that bishops cannot necessarily be on every front to confront the political government, but when you have a laity that is really dedicated and committed, I think in the political space of the Congo today, the opposition is no longer trustworthy to the point that it is the Conseil de laïcs chrétiens, catholique, which has come up as a new opposition force to force the current government to implement decisions of democracy. So just to say briefly that what the paper of Lado was saying is to remind the laity that the Catholic social teaching is our common heritage. It is not only for the priests or the bishops. It is up to the Catholic laity also to appropriate that heritage, that resource, and utilize it for the advancement of just societies. But thank you very much for the observation and comment.
Okay. Ramon Lusaraga, United States. Father Himes. Had organized labor in the United States maintained its strength and its influence, could that have directed more constructively, perhaps blunted the things that you described in your talk in terms of white frustration, white anger, that sort of thing?
To a degree, yes. I mean, one of the things that traditionally what labor movements did in the United States, the major labor movements, was it did mediate the individual workers' interests with larger concerns of organized labor and larger ways of defining relating to the political order. And so I do think you find that if you go back in terms of the US labor movement, you find people like Walter Reuther with United Auto Workers, who was actually considerably more progressive than his membership on integrating the workforce, considerably more progressive in terms of looking for some sort of stronger role for a national healthcare system and the like. But because in the United States, unlike some other countries, the labor movement has always sort of sided with economic self-interest of its members rather than being a political agent promoting the common good. The labor movement in the United States has never had quite the same political social role in the United States that it has had in other countries. The defining of that came early on with the decline of the Knights of Labor, the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, American Federation of Labor. That history of labor has been that in the United States, labor movements have generally been understood in terms of promoting their own members' economic self-interests. Reuther, to some degree, George Meany and some other labor leaders did try to move beyond that and try to help workers see that they have a role to play in the larger socio-political order. So I think they could have done something, a vibrant labor union movement could have done something to blunt at least, I think, some of the most nativist elements of what we're seeing now in the United States. It wouldn't have removed it entirely, because the labor movement in the United States has played a different role in American history than labor movements have played in some other countries.
Oui, je suis Marie-Rose Ndimbo, doctorante à l'Université catholique du Congo. J'ai une petite question au Père Toussaint. Quelque part dans votre exposé, vous avez fait remarquer que l'Église ne s'attaque pas aux causes des injustices dans le monde, mais plutôt aux effets. Alors ma petite question est celle-ci. Concrètement, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire? Qu'est-ce que vous proposez? Parce que finalement, l'Église, c'est qui? J'ai l'impression que l'Église, c'est nous qui sommes réunis aussi ici. Et à notre niveau, nous pouvons aussi proposer quelque chose. Qu'est-ce que vous dites? Merci.
Okay, I will just repeat the question quickly in English for those who do not. I don't know if it has been translated already by translators, but where the question is, the paper of Lado is saying that the church has not been addressing the root causes of all these crises, political and social, that we encounter in Africa, but instead the church has been addressing maybe the consequences, the effects of the crisis. Which to some extent is very true. And the sister was asking, who is the church if not us here? Which is an amazing observation that you're making. Very quickly, I would say that for those who know Lado, he's a man who has been very much involved in trying to shake the structures of injustice in Africa, in Cameroon, and everywhere that he's been working. And in the paper, he was saying, at some point you just realize how dangerous such commitment can become, because the powers that be are not happy and they feel threatened by that prophetic commitment of the church. So it is my hope that such gatherings should be also listening to what the church is doing in other places and say, what hand can we lend to those who are doing that kind of thing? For instance, Father Lado has written and addressed the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Cameroon. He has addressed the government of Cameroon, and I think such a gathering could maybe, sign a petition to say, this is the work that we're supposed to be doing, we support it. But the church, it is us, it is you, it is the, everybody else. I will keep it short and leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers, Mary, Father George, Father Kenneth, and Father Toussaint, and to all those who participated in the discussion. So let's give them a round of applause. Christine Heyer will now give instructions for the next activity, the Continental Discussion Groups.
I just want to echo Agnes's thanks to our first plenary panel today addressing our key conference themes. Thank you, all of you. If I could just have 1 minute for instructions for our next interactive step. Today and tomorrow, as you know, you will have a chance to meet in continental discussion groups. If you could open your programs to page 12, I just have one room change, and we can all be on the same page. Continental leaders from all of our regions will lead you through small group and larger group discussions in these sessions. Today's theme is an examination of conscience, so you'll consider how well you've networked regionally. Even more importantly, coffee will be available in each of the continental discussion group rooms. The African region will go with Elias to the library. The Asian region, because of numbers, we have switched you to a slightly larger room just down the hall from what's indicated here. The Asian region will follow Agnes and Shaji to the meeting room in the attic, the 3rd floor of the new building. The Latin American region will follow Emil Sekuda to the meeting room in the attic in the old building, so we've changed the signage. The European region will stay here in the auditorium, and the North American region will go up to the gymnasium where the posters are. Finally, those going to the Asian or Latin American regional discussion groups who have difficulty walking at all, who don't want to climb the 3 flights of stairs, if you could meet the wonderful Marina Pregernik here at the stage, after she will direct you to the elevator that can take you directly there. I will trust the continental leaders to take you through the conversations, but I would invite you to watch time and join us here at 11:45 for our next plenary with Charles Curran. Thank you again to the first plenary panel.